I put tariffs on things coming in to the country, including beef. And that gave them a chance to finally have a decent industry. But I also want to keep the beef prices low.
Panic hit Washington like a thunderclap the moment Africa announced the ban. Phones rang non-stop inside the White House as officials scrambled to understand how a single decision could wipe out $15 billion of American agricultural exports overnight. But the real shock came when reports revealed something no one wanted to admit. Africa's retaliation was directly triggered by Donald Trump's revived tariff policy, a policy designed to pressure foreign markets, but now backfiring with devastating force.
Have soared to all-time highs, with many families feeling the squeeze. Economics correspondent Paul Solman looks at the factors driving prices higher.
Got a beef with beef prices? You've got company.
I was looking at the price of a pound of ground beef, and 3 months ago it was $4.99 a pound, and a week ago Saturday it was $7.99 a pound.
And it's not just beef.
It seems lately like every time I go into the store, I have
probably noticed that your grocery bill is higher lately, right? Especially when it comes to beef.
But as CBS News Miami's Michael George shows, I should say, many Americans are still not ready to cut out meat from their diet.
A mouth-watering cut of beef is costing you an arm and a leg.
Yeah, I'd say almost $5 a pound more expensive for your ground beef, hanger steak, stuff like that.
The price of beef has shot through the roof, up 13.9% annually.
Percent since last year. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt looked to quell the fears of America's cattle ranchers this week at the podium. Watch this.
President loves our ranchers, and he also loves American consumers, and he wants to do right by both. So the immediate solution to the problem of the rising cost of beef, President wants to bring that down, as we have to increase our supply. And so that's what he's doing with respect to these imports.
Trump had insisted the U.S. could win any trade war, but Africa united, confident, and rising had just proved him wrong. With one bold move, African nations shut their doors to U.S. beef, sending markets into chaos, and exposing the weakness of Trump's aggressive tariff strategy. As media headlines exploded, one question took over global newsrooms: how did Africa manage to corner a former superpower, force Donald Trump's America into its biggest agricultural crisis in decades?
The shock hit Washington like a thunderclap. One moment, trade officials were preparing the routine quarterly report on agricultural exports. The next, alarms erupted across every major department. Africa, once one of America's most reliable destinations for agricultural goods, had just announced a continent-wide suspension of U.S. beef imports. No warning, no gradual transition, no negotiations, just a decisive and unified declaration made during a high-level continental economic summit in Addis Ababa. The headlines exploded across global markets. Africa blocks U.S. beef. Washington scrambles to respond. 15 billion agricultural shock. Within minutes, American ranchers began calling their representatives. Beef processors demanded emergency briefings. Senators from agricultural states rushed to the nearest cameras, insisting the move was unexpected, unprecedented, and economically destabilizing. For decades, U.S. beef exports had flowed into Africa with ease. The markets were strong, the profits consistent, and the competition minimal. American officials believed the arrangement was permanent, but Africa had changed dramatically. The ban was strategic, calculated, and part of a larger transformation reshaping the entire continent. In recent years, Africa had been rewriting its food policies, agricultural frameworks, and economic alliances. A shift had been quietly building away from dependency towards self-sufficiency, regional processing, and domestic industry. Protection. The U.S. beef ban was not an isolated move. It was the first public sign of a new chapter in African economic power. The announcement came during a sweeping reform declaration known simply as the Continental Food Sovereignty Pact. For years, African livestock producers had complained about cheap foreign beef flooding their markets, depressing local prices, and undermining domestic ranchers who couldn't compete with heavily industrialized U.S. suppliers. African leaders vowed to change the pattern. Now they had, and Washington had never imagined Africa would coordinate so quickly or so effectively. Within days, American beef storage facilities filled to the brim, warehouses overflowed. cold storage across the Midwest and Southwest reached capacity. The U.S. agricultural sector had no alternative market large enough to absorb the redirected supply. For the first time in decades, ranchers found themselves staring at a crisis with no immediate solution. In Africa, the reaction was very different. Local ranchers celebrated. Meat processors opened new facilities. Governments announced incentive programs to boost cattle production, expand grazing land management, and modernize feed systems. Major African supermarkets signed agreements with regional producers, shifting supply entirely to domestic and continental sources. The message was clear. Africa wanted control over its food economy. Washington misread the signals entirely. When African leaders publicly discussed food sovereignty years earlier, U.S. officials dismissed the idea as political rhetoric. But Africa wasn't bluffing. The new economic policies were rooted in coordinated planning among multiple African regions. They shared research, improved veterinary services, strengthened livestock tracking systems, and developed new animal disease prevention corridors. The moves were part of a long-term vision one America had failed to take seriously. The blow rippled far beyond ranches. Shipping companies lost contracts. Cold chain logistics firms faced downturns. Meat packing corporations lost billions in projected revenue, and financial markets reacted violently. The U.S. beef sector, valued at over $100 billion domestically, could not afford a $15 billion export. Loss in a single quarter. Washington's first instinct was to retaliate, but Africa didn't flinch. Diplomats tried to convince African leaders that the ban was excessive. Trade representatives argued that American beef met the highest standards. Agriculture officials insisted the decision was politically motivated, but Africa didn't budge. The ban wasn't personal, it was economic. Africa had decided to protect its livestock industry, and no amount of pressure would reverse it. Behind closed doors, however, Africa's decision had deeper motivations that Washington failed to read. One motivation was health standards. African livestock researchers had long warned about the heavy use of hormones and antibiotics in U.S. beef. African consumers had begun demanding safer, domestically sourced meat, free from additives and foreign industrial processing. Public trust played a role. The ban reinforced faith in African agriculture. Another motivation was geopolitical realignment. For decades, Africa had relied heavily on imports for essential food products. But the global economic shocks of the previous decade, from pandemics to supply chain crises, revealed the vulnerability of external dependence when shipping. Delays left African shelves empty. Leaders vowed never to experience such insecurity again. The beef ban was part of a broader mission to take control of Africa's food destiny. American analysts failed to understand one fundamental reality. Africa was no longer the passive consumer it used to be. The new Africa was strategic, coordinated, and assertive. U.S. senators called emergency hearings, grilling agricultural officials on how they had failed to anticipate the ban. Economists warned that the crisis could expand into other sectors if Africa widened its restrictions. The fear wasn't irrational. African nations were also reviewing poultry imports, corn shipments, wheat contracts, and genetically modified seed supply chains. In the American Midwest, panic spread. Cattle producers who had expanded operations based on rising export demand were suddenly facing bankruptcy. Auction yards reported record numbers of cattle being sold off at low prices. Feedlots shut down. Workers were laid off. Livelihoods were collapsing. Meanwhile, Africa's livestock industry surged. Exports between African regions grew at record speed. Processing plants opened in East Africa, Southern Africa, and parts of West Africa. African-owned cold chain logistics companies gained market share. For the first time in modern memory, Africa's beef industry was booming without relying on foreign suppliers. International investors noticed. Funds that once poured money into U.S. beef futures began quietly shifting capital into African agriculture indexes. The economic narrative had reversed. Africa was no longer the import market. It was becoming a global agricultural powerhouse. Washington underestimated how quickly global demand would adjust. Countries in Asia and the Middle East began signing bilateral agreements with African ranching blocs. African beef, once overlooked, now carried new prestige low in additives, grass-fed, and from rapidly modernizing ecosystems. American analysts were stunned. The U.S. expected the ban to isolate Africa, not elevate it. The pressure grew stronger when African nations announced the next phase of their strategy, a high-tech livestock certification system developed in partnership with African tech startups. The system used blockchain to track cattle from birth to slaughter, ensuring transparency across the entire supply chain. The innovation stunned global markets and instantly made African beef more attractive. The U.S. beef industry, heavily industrialized and reliant on mass production, suddenly looked outdated. In Washington, the conversation shifted from pressure to desperation. Officials began proposing incentives to rebuild ties with African agricultural markets. Lobbyists pushed for diplomatic missions. Trade envoys traveled across African capitals offering new terms, new prices, and partnership frameworks. Africa listened politely, then declined. The ban stayed. In truth, Africa wasn't trying to punish America. The move was simply logical. A continent that had spent decades exporting raw materials while importing basic foods had finally built the infrastructure to feed itself. Africa didn't want dependency. It wanted strength, and the ban symbolized that new strength. But Washington wasn't ready to accept the shift. The agricultural lobby demanded retaliation, tariffs, countermeasures, sanctions. Some policymakers considered a targeted trade response, but their advisors warned against it. Africa's alliances had grown too strong. Any economic retaliation could backfire and isolate the U.S. even further. The deeper reality was more uncomfortable. The U.S. had assumed for so long that Africa needed it, but now it was clear Africa didn't. The final blow came when Africa announced a multi-billion-dollar livestock corridor project connecting several major regions via rail, chilled storage hubs, and centralized veterinary services. The initiative instantly became one of the most advanced food logistics projects in the world. American agricultural analysts warned that the project would permanently shift global beef supply in Africa's favor. The U.S. beef industry could not compete with a continental system designed for 21st century efficiency. Washington's shock turned into something else, something quieter and more sobering. Acceptance. Africa had evolved. Africa had outgrown the old trade arrangements. Africa was rising in ways that reshaped global markets, and the U.S., for the first time in generations, had been slapped with a lesson it never imagined it would learn. Africa was now a global economic force. The $15 billion blow was not just a financial hit, it was a geopolitical wake-up call. A signal that the global order had shifted, a warning that Africa's new confidence was rewriting the rules of trade, a message that no world power, not even the United States, could ignore. Washington finally understood something it had overlooked for too long. Africa was not the market of yesterday. Africa was the powerhouse of tomorrow, and the world would have to adjust. The shockwaves spread far beyond America's ranches as the shutdown of beef imports deepened. In Washington, officials tried to keep calm in public, but inside every department from agriculture to trade there was unfiltered panic. Africa's decision wasn't just a rejection of a commodity. It was a declaration of economic independence, and the U.S. knew it had no immediate leverage to reverse it. The next morning, U.S. analysts woke up to even worse news. African agricultural councils had released a unified statement confirming that the ban on American beef was not temporary, not conditional, and not symbolic. It was structural. It was permanent unless Washington fundamentally restructured its approach to global trade, safety standards, and international respect. The United States had never been treated this way by an entire continent. The media tried to minimize the blow, claiming Africa had only made a regional decision, but the markets weren't fooled. Investor sentiment tanked. Meatpacking giants lost billions in valuation in just hours. The agricultural lobby, terrified, demanded emergency talks with U.S. officials, insisting that the government settle whatever dispute had caused this catastrophe. But there was nothing to settle. Africa's statement emphasized that the ban came after years of unmet safety concerns, environmental complaints, and violations of trade promises. They made it clear that they were no longer willing to accept double standards where they had to meet every U.S. regulation while America ignored theirs. For decades, African nations had been treated as markets to be dominated. Now they were making it clear they were partners or nothing. The White House press secretary held a brief conference, trying desperately to calm the situation. She said the U.S. would evaluate Africa's concerns and open a channel for discussion. But everyone could see it, the nervous shifting, the careful wording, the tone of a superpower suddenly feeling the consequences of underestimating a rising continent. The wind had changed, and Washington knew it. Meanwhile, across Africa, celebrations weren't wild or loud, they were confident, purposeful. It wasn't just about beef. It was about principle. The decision signaled that Africa was no longer willing to be the world's dumping ground for products that failed higher standards elsewhere. They were no longer silent participants in global trade, they were shaping it. But the biggest shift happened when Asia stepped forward. Within 72 hours of Africa's announcement, trade ministers from several Asian nations proposed new agricultural agreements offering better prices, better standards, and better partnership terms than the U.S. ever had. Europe, realizing it was about to lose access to the same markets, scrambled to schedule emergency meetings with African leaders. But Africa wasn't in a rush. For the first time, they dictated the timeline. Farmers across the United States, watching their futures collapse, began to pressure Congress aggressively. They argued that ignoring Africa's concerns for so long had cost the country billions. They demanded that America shift its policies and negotiate fairly, but America's political system was divided, and any delay only strengthened Africa's hand. What Washington didn't understand at first was that Africa had been preparing for this moment. Over the last decade, they had invested massively in local livestock industries, sustainable grazing programs, and food processing infrastructure. They weren't banning U.S. beef because they wanted leverage, they were banning it because they didn't need it anymore. The U.S., however, needed Africa. America exported more agricultural goods to Africa than to any region outside its closest allies. Losing access to that market didn't just hit ranchers. It hit the trucking industry, the feed suppliers, the processors, the rail networks, and the logistics companies tied to the agricultural chain. The ripple effects were massive. Within 2 weeks, several American agricultural towns declared states of economic emergency. But the greatest blow came when one of the largest U.S. cattle corporations announced layoffs across multiple states. Thousands suddenly found themselves without income, and the public finally realized what Washington had been trying to hide. This was not a minor trade dispute. It was a structural collapse of a key American export sector, and it was caused entirely by Africa's new position on the global stage. Meanwhile, across multiple African capitals, leaders met quietly to discuss the next steps. Their unity had worked. Their strategy had succeeded. They had proven that when African countries acted together, the world had no choice but to listen. Now that the U.S. beef ban was complete, African nations were ready to move to the next phase, rewriting trade agreements from top to bottom. No more one-sided deals, no more unequal standards, no more dependency on Western validation. Instead, Africa began preparing a new continental agricultural framework centered on intra-African trade, food security, regional processing zones, and modern export standards that matched or exceeded global expectations. It wasn't born from anger. It was born from evolution. For decades, Africa's role in international economics had been defined for them. Now they were defining it themselves, and the world was scrambling to react. In Washington, the Agriculture Department held a closed-door meeting that dragged on for 10 straight hours. Advisors warned that if the government didn't act fast, Africa's move could inspire other regions to follow. If that happened, U.S. agricultural exports could face a chain reaction of rejections, and underneath all the numbers, one truth echoed. For the first time ever, the U.S. was vulnerable to African economic power. The ban shifted from being a trade issue to a geopolitical crisis. Washington realized that losing access to African markets meant losing influence, a scenario they had never planned for. The president's advisors urged immediate diplomatic outreach, but African leaders were not eager to meet. They had been ignored for too long. And now, with Asia and South America courting them, they had alternatives. The U.S. needed Africa now more than Africa needed the U.S. Days stretched in 2 weeks, and the crisis only deepened. Domestic beef prices soared as exports dried up. Storage warehouses filled to capacity. The government considered buying excess beef to prevent a total industry collapse, but even that wouldn't solve the long-term problem. The only solution was cooperation, and Washington could barely swallow that. Finally, after immense pressure, the U.S. sent a delegation to Africa requesting a formal discussion. They hoped the gesture would reverse the ban or at least soften the blow. But Africa answered with a polite, powerful message. We welcome dialogue, but we will not reopen our markets until full compliance with our agricultural regulations is guaranteed. That single sentence changed everything. It was not a threat. It was a policy, a sovereign stance. and for the first time in history, the U.S. had no choice but to accept Africa's terms because the global agricultural chain had already shifted. Investors, exporters, and corporations had begun repositioning toward Africa's rising industries. New processing facilities were opening. New trade routes were emerging. New partnerships were being formed. America was no longer the unquestioned center of agricultural trade. Africa had entered the global arena as a full-power, assertive, confident, and united. And the rest of the world, whether they admitted it or not, was now adjusting to Africa's lead. In the end, the ban on U.S. beef wasn't just a $15 billion economic loss. It was a turning point. A moment when Africa showed that it could tilt global markets, rewrite international policy, and reshape geopolitical influence, all with a single unified decision. And Washington, realizing the new balance of power, could do nothing but watch as Africa stepped confidently into a future it was now helping to build.